Using photons is a two-passes process. The first pass is to generate a photon map, and the second will use this photon map to calculate things like indirect illumination and caustics. So basically, what happens is that your lights, much like light sources in real life, will emit photons, and those photons will travel through your scene, bouncing off surfaces or going through transparent surfaces, etc. This way, the energy coming from the light source is distributed across the scene, and it's of course affected by the properties of the surfaces of the scene, like the color, for example, which causes color bleeding. So as I said, it's a two-step process. The first step is to create the photon map. To do that, I will go to the parameters of my Mantra render node, and under the PBR tab, if I go a little bit down, you can see a parameter called global photon file. And it's here where you specify the file in which you will be saving your photon map. So for now, I will leave it just as $hip global pmap, and it will save the file just beside my hip files. Let me hit cancel. And then, all I have to do is to go to the rendering tab here and switch this physically based rendering engine to photon map generation. One thing I also want to do before hitting the render button is that I want to turn the statistics on my render node on, because for the photon map generation we won't be having any visual feedback. So to know where we are in the photon map generation process, because sometimes it may take a long time, so it's a good idea to turn the statistics on. This way you know the advancement of the photon map generation process. So let me go to the statistics. I'll take the verbose level to 5, and I'll turn on Alfred style progress. And now all is left to do, I will just hit render, and my Houdini console will pop up, and it will show me the advancement of my photon map generation process. Here you can see that I've got 100%, and it gives me some information about my render. So now my photon map is generated, and I can use it in the next step. Let me close this window. Sometimes you may need to see what your photon map looks like. So it's very easy in Houdini. Just let me minimize mplay, and I'll go to my obj context, and here I'll create a geometry, and inside this geometry I have this file import by default, and instead of this defgeo.bgeo, I'll just click on this button here, and I will specify my global.pmap. I'll hit accept. Then I will go to my viewport. I'll hit W to make it wireframe, and I'll hit on display points. This is my photon map, basically. You can see it here. Two things I want to mention here is that my constant shaders, or the faces on which I have constant shaders, don't have photons on them. And the second thing I want to mention is that you can see those shadow areas. You can remember that under my spheres I have shadows, so in those shadow areas I do not have photons, which is only normal. So now let me just go and delete this file I imported. I'll just delete this geometry node here. Then the next step will be using this photon map file with our PBR renderer. So let me go back to my camera view. I'll hit W again, and then I'll go to my out context, and in my Mantra 1 node here, just remember to switch the rendering engine back from photon map generation to physically based rendering, and under the PBR parameters, one thing is left to do is to switch this secondary GI cache from none to photon map. And this way, I'm telling the physically based rendering engine to use this photon map I have just generated, because it's still specified here in this global photon file. I'm telling the physically based rendering engine to use it. In the first pass, where I have my rendering engine set to photon map generation, this parameter was used to save the photon map file, and when I switched back my rendering engine to physically based rendering engine, this parameter is now serving for using this global pmap I have just created. So now all is left to do is to just click on the render button to use this photon map, and now I have my feedback with this Houdini console. Let me stop the video here because it will take some time, and I will be back when it's done. My render is now done, and you can see directly that the global illumination is taking place, and it can be seen very easily, especially on the left side the red color, on the right side the green color, etc. So this way I used a photon map to generate global illumination or indirect illumination in my scene. Don't forget that this photon map process is a two-passes process, so the first thing you have to do is to create the photon map, and the second thing you have to do is to use this photon map. One interesting thing you can do here is just, let me close this window, by taking this mantra 1 and going to its rendering engine, switching it to photon map generation, and switching the secondary GI cache to none. Then I will duplicate this mantra node, I will copy and paste it, and in this mantra 2 node I will change back this secondary GI cache to photon map, then I will change back the render engine to physically based render engine, and then I will connect mantra 1 to mantra 2. This way I can generate the photon map and use it with just the click of one button. So if I now hit the render button on mantra 2, it will directly and by itself render mantra 1, so it will generate the photon map automatically, and then it will use it. So I won't be obliged to every time change the rendering engine, then change any other parameters in my render node. What if I want to use those photon maps, but without using the physically based rendering? I want to use them with the micropolygon rendering or with the ray tracing rendering. Let me just delete my mantra 2 node, and in my mantra 1 node I'll just go to the rendering engine and I will switch it, let us say, to micropolygon rendering. Next I will go to my shop context. I still have this Vex global illumination light in here, so I will go to its photon maps tab, and under global photon map I will click on this button here, and I will specify the global.p map file I had just created for the previous example. Let me hit accept. I'm not sure why you would want to use this method, but since it exists, I'm showing it. In fact, this may be interesting for caustics, so we can obtain caustics without using the physically based rendering engine. So now let me just render my mantra node. I will wait a little bit for it. Now we see that we don't have any global illumination going, and I just know why, because I forgot to recreate my light template here. I will just hit tab, I'll create a light template, and I will connect my Vex global illumination to this light template. Now if I render, I should get some global illumination going. In fact, I don't see the global illumination, and there's one thing I also forgot to do, is that if you go to the Vex global illumination, you remember before I switched it to ambient occlusion. In fact, we have to have full irradiance here, so now I will switch to full irradiance. And one thing I do not want to forget, I will go to my out context, and in my mantra node I will go to the sampling tab, and I will take the pixel samples down to 3, because if I'll leave them at 13 it will take forever to render. So let me now hit render. It's taking a little bit of time, so I will stop the render here and I'll be back when it's done. It took a little bit of time to render, but you can see that I've got a very nice indirect lighting effect. So now you saw how you can use this photon maps technique with the micropolygon rendering engine, and you can do the same for the ray tracing engine also. So you are not limited to the physically based rendering engine to use those photon maps. And one more thing I want to mention here is that this photon maps technique, in fact, we used it to create indirect lighting, but you can use the same technique to create caustic effects. And if we look at our, let me just go to my PBR tab here, and you look here, you can see this global photon file parameter which specifies the global photon maps. And you can see another parameter called caustic photon file, and here you can specify a caustic photon file for your caustics calculation. And if you go also to the Vex global illumination light, and under the photon maps you can also find a parameter called caustic photon map. So you can use this same photon maps technique to create caustics, just like we did for the indirect illumination we have just created. Let me next show you yet another technique to create indirect lighting, and it's by adding indirect lighting on a material by material basis.